our first speaker this afternoon is Jolyon Baraka Thomas from the University of Pennsylvania, and he will be talking on the topic of scholars of religion as educational policy actors.
So first of all, let me just start off by saying it's a real pleasure to be here back at the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture. I think that Paul Swanson mentioned this in his remarks yesterday, but I came to Shibunken for, I think, the first iteration of the sort of get young PhD students to present their work in Japanese thing that Shibunken did. And so I have very fond memories of that, that experience. I also want to say that the current editor of the JJRS, Matt McMullen, is a dear friend of mine, a partner in crime, former roommate, and former office mate. So it's just really great to see the JJRS in his capable hands. First of all, let me also just say I hate my title, and this is not the title of the article I have. I just needed to put something on paper, and I was really busy this spring. But hopefully, what I have to say will be more interesting than the title. I want to start off with a pair of images, both from the same month in 1942. And I'm starting with these because I think they elicit a certain type of emotional or affective response. On the left, we have a bunch of children. They are not Nazis. They are American children performing what's called the Bellamy salute, which is a salute to the flag. Because of the Nazi Germany, similar sort of ritual practice that the US discontinued this practice about 6 months after this photo was taken. But for a long time, school children in the United States would pledge allegiance to the flag by raising their hands in a very ritualistic manner. And then, of course, on the right, we have a picture taken from the very same month in Nakamikoto in Tokyo of Japanese school children with military gear performing rituals in front of a Hoan. So why would I start off with these two images? Well, on the one hand, I think they are interesting because they provide a real sort of affective charge for us in this moment after the Second World War. And for many of us, these images make us profoundly uncomfortable. Why would we make kids do this sort of thing? Why would we make them, parade around with rifles in front of Hoan-den, enshrining the emperor? Why would we make them pledge allegiance to the flag in such a way? And I think these affective responses that we currently have are themselves data that's worthy of analysis. Like the very fact that we would have that kind of reaction is something that I want to sort of treat as something we should think about. I'm not assuming that you all have the same reaction that I do, but I think that many of us see these sorts of images and we're sort of like, ew. And I also think that what we choose to do based on these sorts of emotional reactions is another thing that's worthy of study. So indeed, scholars of religion, I'm assuming that you all are in some way or another a scholar of religion. So scholars of religion, us, looked at these sorts of practices, and in the wake of Japan's defeat, they're like, well, do patriotic rituals necessarily have a religious component? Or to make a good citizen, do you need to have something like religion? And if so, what do we, scholars of religion, have to say about it? I won't be talking about patriotic rituals specifically so much, but I wanted to give that image or that pair of images at the start of this talk to sort of give you a sense of the kinds of images, practices, ideas, and so forth to which scholars of religion have regularly responded over the last 75 years or so. So let me give you just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm working on a book that's got the working title, Difficult Subjects. It's about the history of religion and tax-funded education in Japan and the United States from 1945 up until the present. It's sort of building on a longstanding question that I've had. I used to think it was basically just like, what is religion? And now I realize that that's not really my question. My abiding question is through all of the work that I have published is who defines religion and how do they do so and with what political effects? And in this particular talk, I'm curious about scholars of religion as agents who define religion. I'm curious about what role we've played in formulating educational policy in determining the parameters of what counts as religion. And I'm saying us because this has been an inherently transnational process. American intellectuals were regularly weighing in on educational policy for post-defeat Japan, and Japanese intellectuals were regularly borrowing policy from the United States. And I'll show you some concrete examples momentarily. Now, I also think that focusing on education is really valuable if you're interested in the question of how people define religion, because it elucidates this thing that I think of as one of the abiding questions for our field. Like, what sort of political responsibilities do we have as scholars? What sort of political responsibilities do we have when it comes to things like citizenship training or other democratic projects? And I want to pause here. It's not on my slide, but just to say that a lot of times I think there's this assumption that scholarship on religion is necessarily politically progressive, or I think that scholarship on religion is an antidote for conservative or retrogressive projects. But I think that it's a much more complicated story than that. Indeed, I have a little bit of discomfort about the way that some of the assumptions that we make about the politics of religious studies. Let me just share some of that. In both my current book manuscript and in the book that I published most recently called Faking Liberties, I observed to my great discomfort that scholars of religion have often capitalized on crisis in order to advance our own pet project. We're political animals, right? I do think, and this came up yesterday, we have crucial expertise to offer to people who are not necessarily scholars themselves. But I fear that we often will make these sort of functionalist claims where we're going to assert that everybody is religious. Deep down, even the people who claim to be Mushugyo, they're really, really religious. We're just going to like tell them like that we're going to explain the way that they don't even know how to explain themselves. Or we'll assert that people have spiritual needs. What work does this do? Well, it makes us look really important, is what it does. And at times, and I'll show some examples of this, scholars of religion have even reproduced that great capitalist talking point that religion is what distinguishes capitalism from godless communism. Is that our job? Is that the thing that we're supposed to be doing? Now, I recently read and was very stimulated by Yanis Gaitanides' book on spirituality and alternativity. It just came out this year. And in that book, he describes, borrowing from Ian Hacking, he describes what he calls looping effects. These ways that scholarly discourse can then go to affect the people who are religious, who then re-narrate how they are in so forth. So these sorts of assertions that scholars of religion make about education, about any number of other things, affect the way that religious groups imagine themselves. And that also affects the ways that those groups claim to be contributing to the public good. I think we need to be very careful about this sort of dynamic. And Yanis's book gives a number of great examples related to spirituality discourse. But I think we also need to be very careful about the ways that we might introduce in the guise of neutrality, a type of normativity that we don't formally espouse. Okay, so as many people in this room know, I've done a lot of work on the Allied occupation of Japan at the end of World War II, and that work was mostly encapsulated in my 2019 book, Faking Liberties. And I'm not going to talk about that book today in any detail, but one sort of question that came up that I was pursuing in that book was, does protecting religious freedom require changing the ways that Japanese people are religious? For the occupiers, the answer was yes, but not only for the occupiers. It was also, the answer was yes as well for Japanese scholars of religion, especially scholars based at Tokyo. And these scholars were very interested in telling Japanese people, you're doing religion wrong, we're going to teach you how to do it. Now, there's no sound on this video clip that is going to be playing here, but it's fun to watch anyway. So when these occupiers arrived in Japan, they were trying to sort of think about, well, what do we do in Japan? How do we remake these people? They're terrible people. And the thing that the occupiers sort of got to is it's all because they've had exposure to bad ideas. The Japanese brain is just like our brain, this video says. It's made of exactly the same stuff as ours, but it needs to be taught how to make sense. And so these people who have been trained to play follow the leader, as the text of this video is written by Dr. Seuss, by the way. These people who have been trained to play follow the leader need to be taught instead good ideas. And good ideas are going to be peace-inducing and so forth, as opposed to the things that lead to dead kids lying on beaches. And of course, getting schools to do the work was one of the key sort of aspects of this. Now, the corollary of this claim was also that Japan had been filled with bad ideas, but one of the paradoxical sort of corollary claims was Japan is completely empty. It's a blank slate. And this emerged from General MacArthur, actually, who, in calling for Christian missionaries to come to Japan, said that Japan was a spiritual vacuum. He first made that claim in December 1946, and then the Japanese English language press picked it up and ran with it. So this is a thing that people kept repeating over and over again. Spiritual vacuum, spiritual vacuum, spiritual vacuum. If it's empty, then you got to fill it with something. And if you don't fill it with the right kind of religion, then the Japanese people are going to become communists, or at least they'll become dissolute, amoral people. So going back to Orion's presentation from earlier, there's this notion that religion is something that will make people moral. That's going to make a nation strong. Okay, this is all sort of preamble, but I'll just say that in Faking Liberties, I was I spent a bit of time paying attention specifically to Kishimoto Hideo, who was Anisaki Masaharu's son-in-law. He was also a professor of religious studies at Todai. And he was one of the main voices who both influenced occupation policy, but he was also interested in using his position to tell Japanese people, you're doing religion wrong. Let me tell you how to do it. Kishimoto worked very closely with William P. Woodard, who had been an occupation official and who had worked in the religions division. And he turned his earlier sort of training as a missionary to sort of promoting religious studies in Japan, promoting the study of Japanese religions. These two men working together founded the Kokusai Shukyo Kenkyusho, the International Institute for the Study of Religions. These two men founded contemporary religions in Japan. That's the precursor to the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies. And if you read William Woodard's copious editorial notes, which he added with reckless abandon to many of the publications in contemporary religions of Japan, you'll see him correcting what he saw as mistaken understandings of religion in real time, on the fly. He's basically like, well, they're making this claim, but they're wrong. Let me tell you how to do it. I think that's interesting. I don't think that that's necessarily part of the current JJRS legacy, but I do think that we have to be aware of the ways that scholars of religion have been willing to use things like academic publications to make these sorts of prescriptive claims. Okay, that is an important historical background. Let me turn to my concrete data. 1947 is a key year. There is a moment in both Japan and the United States where the legal settlement about how religion and education are supposed to work together is really clarified for the first time. So in Japan, you have the passage of the Fundamental Law on Education in March of 1947, and then the enactment of the new constitution, both of which make it absolutely clear that you cannot engage in confessional religious education. In the United States, education is not enumerated in the Constitution, so it's a little bit fuzzier, but you have some major Supreme Court rulings from that year and the following year that make it clear that it will become harder and harder for schools to engage in things like Bible reading, school prayer, and stuff like that. So it's clear from this point on in both countries that schools are not to teach religion, not directly. And at the same time, there are a lot of people who are not satisfied. And they're not satisfied with this, mostly because they think the kids these days are terrible. Does that sound familiar? The kids these days. It's like the most boring thing you can ever say. Oh, the kids these days, they're terrible. I was just having this conversation. I'm sorry, we were just having this conversation about how the kids these days are terrible. It's us, we're bad. So Kishimoto publishes this essay in December 1947. It's like the United States and Japan, we're both trying to make sense of this new normal. And we're trying to establish this appropriate relationship between religion and public education. Now, over in America, the American Council on Education, they just did this study about what they call weekday religious education. And basically, this is a cool little workaround where you can like either have like a little carve out time in the middle of the school day where like you get clerics to come into the school and then they'll teach kids about how to be religious. And you can have the Jewish kids go over here and you can have the Baptists go over here and then like the Catholics can go over here and or you can let them out of school a little bit early so they can go to their respective houses of worship. It's not going to last very long. It becomes ruled unconstitutional. But Kishimoto runs this idea. He's like, that's great, except Japanese religions suck. And he's like, they're just not going to be very good at doing this sort of thing. Because Japanese religions are unprepared to take on this weighty responsibility, the only thing that we can do, the only thing left to us is to promote religious literacy in Japanese schools. He said, as young people become independent members of society, the prospect of their religious ignorance is much scarier than the fact that they might have religious prejudice. Social scientific study of religion is indispensable in public schools. Now, I mentioned Yannis Gaitanaidis' book earlier and looping effects. There's an immediate looping effect I just want to quickly draw your attention to here. The Japanese Federation of Religious Organizations immediately responds. Within less than a year, they've published a pamphlet about how to do religious education properly. They're like, oh, Kishimoto, and they're citing him explicitly. Like, Kishimoto says that we can't do religious education, we're going to do it, right? So they're already framing themselves in response to what the scholar of religion is saying, and then offering this sort of policy document. It's a ridiculous document, that's a separate issue. So the reason that's a ridiculous document is that no matter how much the Japanese Religious Federation might have wanted to be promoting religious education in schools, it's constitutionally illegal. You would have to revise the Constitution in order to make this happen. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen, right? But there are all these moral panics about young people, kids these days, going on. And so they keep this idea alive. Only we had religious education, then the kids would be good. It meant that scholars of religion had to keep coming back to this issue. Kishimoto again, this guy's so, he's so predictable. It's great. So Kishimoto, he's like, all the kids these days, they're out of control. Now, there are a lot of people over here who want to do confessional religious instruction, but that's illegal, Kishimoto says. Let me offer a reasonable counter proposal. Now, in the US, this will sound familiar, they've got Sunday school, they've got things that they've already gotten rid of for this time, but they've got Sunday school, but Japanese religions, especially Buddhists, they're not ready to do Sunday school. It's only the Christians who do that stuff, so we don't have that. So the only place for us to do this is in public schools, he says. We've got to do something in the public schools. Now, here's where Kishimoto offers something that's quite interesting. He offers this sort of tripartite typology. He distinguishes between three types of religious education. Religious knowledge education, is this sort of academic approach. He describes it as an intellectual weapon that will protect religious freedom. Basically what we would call religious literacy today. Then he describes religious sentiment education. And for those of you who are familiar with another term we'll bring up later, Shugyo So Kyoiku, this is not that. He calls it Shugyo Cho Kyoiku. And he's basically like, at a basic human level, we're all religious anyway. And so when you get rid of all of the weird intellectual quibbles that people have with one another, then you can teach about this shared deep religious sentiment that's at the core of every human being. Questionable whether that actually exists, but that's what he thinks. And then he, as a foil for these two things that he likes, he says, and then there's sectarian education, shu ha kyoiku, and that's bad. Mostly because we can't trust the religious people to do it because they're terrible. Really weird for a scholar of religion. He's regularly saying that religious people are bad at what they do. But anyway, so he's like, shu ha kyoiku, that's not going to work in schools. It's too partisan, it's too confessional. So he dismisses that, but he says we should have religious sentiment education, shu gyojo cho kyoiku, at the primary school level. We might also translate this as religious appreciation education. And then shu gyo chishiki kyoiku at the secondary. And so he's like, religion is extremely important in our culture. And if we fully understand this, then we might be able to boldly add. to our public education system. And he goes on to add, without being trapped by the religious freedom imported from the West, and I have no idea what but that's his name. Now, I alluded to this before, but Kishimoto was writing in a time when there were a lot of concerns about juvenile delinquency, sometimes called hiko. But that was a general term for a number of things: theft, momohiro-gyu, methamphetamine use, hirokon, and violent crime. So there's and conservatives and progressives are debating about how best to address this. You're not going to be surprised by this. The conservatives, many of whom are associated with the Japanese Ministry of Education, advocate sort of inculcating piety. So if you make the people good, then you're going to make society good. And then the progressives are like, no, they invert it. Basically, they're like, let's address the social inequalities that are rampant in post-defeat Japanese society, and then the moral stuff will all follow. This is sort of an impasse for a long time, especially because the Japan Teachers Union is pushing back against the Ministry of Education. Long story short, the Ministry of Education pushes forward this new policy, morality, in 1958. And this is supposed to be a sort of like Goldilocks thing. Morality isn't religion, but it's close enough to religion that it's going to kind of solve all of it. As you can imagine, focusing on morality does not resolve the question of defining religion. It just begs the question of how to define it, right? Because if these people are called, like, they're regularly saying, well, we need something that's like religion, but not really religion. Let's call it morality. Dotoku is going to solve our problems. Now, like I said, morality time is supposed to be this Goldilocks solution. It's not quite religion, it's close enough, it's going to make the kids good. And then 1960. So they just rolled this out in April 1958. Like less than 2 years have gone by, and like thousands, tens of thousands of Japanese students are pouring into the streets to protest the US-Japan Security Treaty. A female college student is killed, and all of these people are like, WTF, like this was supposed to, morality time was supposed to solve things, but morality time didn't solve things. All these kids are like getting beaten up in the street, and they're doing the snake dance in the street and stuff like that. Okay, so you've got the kids are still doing drugs. They're still like consuming pornography, and they're having sex with each other. And so morality time is not working. And a lot of people are like, it's not working because it's not religious enough. Let's take a quote, which I pulled, by the way, from Contemporary Religions in Japan, by Nagata Masaguchi, who's a movie producer. I'm pretty sure he was a Nichiren Buddhist. And he's like, if we look back at the kinds of young people, he's offering his own typology, who have appeared since the end of the war. We've got demobilized soldiers. They're the ones distributing the drugs because they were first, it was distributed to them as soldiers, keep them awake so they can plan their plans. Next come the part-time workers, the aloha gangs, the mambo gangs, like all of these people. You've got the student protesters, and they're just seeking outlets for their youthful energy through violence and sex and gambling. Now, he goes on, there are mambo gangs and the Beat generation in Europe and the United States too, but there it's really different because all of those kids are trained from an early age to go to church every Sunday. Side note, because I'm talking about the United States too, anybody who was in the United States at that time who would have known that he was making this assertion would have laughed like you guys did, because what was happening in the United States, all of these concerns about moral panics about juvenile delinquency. It's great. But basically, the United States and Europe serves as a foil for Nagata to make this claim. We're not religious enough. Religion is the thing that's going to make our kids good. So this comparative impulse is really widespread. This claim that Japan doesn't have enough religion but needs it is really, really common. We find it throughout journalism from the time period, from the early 60s. The editor of the Buddhist Times said that there was neither morality nor religion in Japanese households and society. He was drawing a comparison with Britain. And went on to say that, but there's great hunger for religion. Like if we look at the most popular radio programs, like everybody's super interested in religion. And if we go to like Matsushita Denki and all of the other major corporations, they're all making all the new workers, the Shain, participate in Zazen. Like, and all these young workers are like, yeah, it was really awesome. See, everybody wants to be religious. It's not just him. This idea filters up to the very highest levels of the Japanese political world. Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato, 1962. Some people say that Japan lacks sufficient housing, but what I think we really lack is religiosity, communication. So you've got a sitting prime minister who's basically like, we're not religious enough, we've got to be more and more religious. And Ikeda has also made it his stated objective to double Japan's GDP within the space of a decade. And his way of encapsulating this is this really vague term, hitozukuri, which he's borrowed from the founder of Panasonic, Matsushita Kurosuke. So he's like, hitozukuri. And everybody's like, what do you mean? He's like, I don't know, hitozukuri, you tell me. And so, but basically, it's the idea that you're going to train people to be good technical experts, and you're going to get them to be good moral people at the same time. They're going to work together like two wheels in a car, says one observer. Ikeda, glossing this, is like, whether it's the kami or the Buddhas or the sun, I don't care. As long as somebody prays, that's the kind of person we're going to make. And then he says to the Ministry of Education, make that kind of person. So that's basically what happens. The Minister of Education then calls together a committee and he's like, we need to know what kind of person we're making. What's the end product of hitozukuri? And it takes them 18 months. But for the next 18 months, everybody's focused on the ideal human figure, ningenzo. And sometimes they're talking about like riso nai ningenzo or risoteki nai ningenzo. Eventually, this committee that's been convened comes up with this really awkwardly titled report called Kitai Sareru Ningenzo. And now in my book project, I'm deliberately translating this very awkwardly as the human figure we can hope for / count on, because I think that they're deliberately trying to use Kitai Sareru in this passive construction is weird. But basically they're trying to say somebody that has professional aptitude and the right attitude. Basically, not somebody who's going to be doing all of that needs. Somebody who's going to be diligent, focused, right? Not surprisingly, given the way that Ikeda Hayato was talking about this report really emphasized religion as the core of the ideal Japanese citizen. They lamented changes in Japan's spiritual climate, excuse me. They decried mechanization and animalization of young people. They linked human nature, ningensei, with religion. This is also something that they borrowed, I think, directly or indirectly from Kishimoto and other scholars of religion, who kept saying religion is the thing that makes us human. Just to give you an example of the kind of theological language that was in here, they advocated developing gratitude to the universal life force, uchuteki seimeiyo. They said, don't engage in dissolute behavior. Sundays were originally designed for worshiping the gods, and you should do the same thing. And they did all of this in the imperative tone, nani nani nani, right? So this report was part of a broader sort of intellectual trend that is, I'm glossing over a bunch of stuff that I've read in educational journals and so forth, but these policymakers are basically constantly comparing Japan with the West, and they're treating the West, wherever that is, as the norm. And they assume along the way that Christianity provides this shared moral compass for all Westerners, whoever they are. Now, basically what I think they're doing is they're mistaking Cold War ideological claims for sociological facts. The other thing that they're doing is turning influential sociological theories into how-to manuals. They really like Max Weber. We need our own version of the Protestant ethic, they say. Where's our Protestant ethic? America got theirs, we need our own. So then you can imagine the scholars of religion are just chomping at the bit. They're like, oh, have you read Durkheim? Like, we're going to give you social cohesion too. So like all of a sudden you've got like the president of the Japanese Association of Religious Studies writing in an educational journal about Durkheim's notion of social cohesion. Religion is a thing that's going to make people tough it out when the going gets tough, right? Religion is going to make you diligent workers. Religion is going to give people a sense of vocation, potential. It's going to give them a sense of mission. So again, Durkheim, to a certain extent, especially Weber, how-to manual. And what is it teaching us how to do? It's teaching us not only how to make kids good, but how to get rich while we do it. Totally serious here. I know I sound crass, but like that's exactly the language that they're using. It's amazing. Okay, so this human figure, the human figure is religious because the religious person is going to work long hours for low pay and feel good about it. Religiosity naturalizes and justifies extractive, high-growth capitalism and its docile subjects. And the thing that really bothers me, the thing that just like gets under my skin, is that scholars of religion are like, we're going to help you make this person. So I already mentioned the spiritual vacuum talking point. I want to come back to, well, yeah, and many of you may be wondering, well, how are religious people thinking about this? Like, where, like, are they going to leave it up to the scholars of religion, or are they like, how are they going to respond? As you might imagine, the Shinto world is slow to pick up on this. I don't think it's quite unified enough yet at this stage, but the Buddhists have been, gathering together in transsectarian ways for a long time. And they interpret these sorts of assertions rightly, I think, as critiques, basically like people saying, Buddhists, you're not pulling your weight. And you can think about people like Ichikawa Hakugen and others who are also critiquing Buddhists for senso sekinin and for other things. Plus, there's all of the Soshiki Buddhist stuff that's in the air. And so the Buddhists are under attack from all these different fronts. And they're basically like, okay, our job, got it, we're here, we hear you. Our job is to provide moral uplift to the citizenry. I should say, just as context, Kishimoto is dead by this point. He died in 1964, but other of his contemporaries, including Uchi Ichi and I mentioned Ichizu Teruji, keep putting forward this functionalist claim that religion is what makes people good. So then the Buddhists are they're recognizing this and they're responding to it. So basically, they're like, you want a Protestant ethic? Guess who's got a Protestant ethic? Buddhists. Right? So they start to say, you know what, we haven't done our job. Our job is to make people good. Our job is to make good Japanese citizens, and we've not been doing our job. All that juvenile delinquency, we admit it, it's our fault. If only you let us into schools, we can do our job really well. Now, they start off by putting together things like Sunday school programs and curricular development materials. There's an organization that goes by the acronym Zenseikyo, which leads the effort in this front. And at the very same time that committee is developing the Kitai Sareru Ningenzo report, Zenseikyo is developing its own document called Kyo no Ningenzo, Buddhism's image of the human. And in that, they're basically putting forward all of this stuff. Is like, you need to develop children. You need to develop a sense of mission. A sense of mission is what's going to give you fulfillment at work. The luminary Tomomatsu Entai says, one's work, it turns out, could be a path to Buddha. So, and then Buddhists release this declaration in 1966, and they're basically like, let us into schools and we'll solve all of these problems. Now, that's not going to work, right? Why? Oh, there's this pesky thing called the Constitution, which says Buddhists can't go into schools and teach people how to be religious. And ultimately, that legal prohibition prevented Buddhists from doing these things. So Zenseikyo continues, it's still an organization today, but it sort of shifted efforts more to doing things like Sunday school training and other stuff outside of the school and on temple grounds rather than in schools. But there were other people who were educators, professional educators, who were like, you know, there's still something here. We really need to solve this problem. The kids are bad. Kids these days, and he knows. And so there's this group of relatively conservative educators called the League of Education Associations, and they start pushing for what they call religious sensitivity education. This is my translation of Shukyo Jo So Kyoiku, which some of you will have heard of because it's still in the air today. This is a sort of non-sectarian training that's designed to induce religiosity without actually telling people how to be religious, if that's possible. It didn't really get a lot of uptake at the time. These people put a lot of effort into this. They did a lot of sort of background research, but it it was very difficult for anybody to like take the idea seriously. And indeed, pause here and sort of break the frame of my own presentation and say, when I first encountered the concept of Shiukyo Joto Doikyo, I literally laughed out loud. Because it seems so obviously flawed. Apologies to anybody in the room who's a fan. But it's so obviously manipulative. The word ayatsudu is in the phrase, right? Like you're gonna manipulate people's emotions and you're gonna call that good? Like what? It just like made me laugh. And I thought like, how would anybody like, especially a scholar of religion, advance this as a workable sort of thing? I'm putting my cards on the table here in terms of my own proclivities. But I realized soon that initial reaction on my part was a little bit immature, and it didn't take into account the fact that there were a lot of people, including many people I respect, who were like proponents of this idea. And I didn't understand that at first because, again, I kept getting hung up on the word joso, like ayatsudu, like to manipulate the emotions, which it threw me off until I started doing the historical research and I was able to connect it back to Kishimoto's earlier arguments. I was like, oh, this is all part of a long-standing, decades-long project on the part of scholars of religion to prove that we're really important. So then I started paying attention much more carefully. Well, what other words have we used to modify religion or religious? How have we tried to recode religion to make it palatable to policymakers, to find jobs for our graduates, and to bypass the constitutional prohibition on religious instruction? And as soon as I started paying attention to that, I was like, oh, there it is, right? So scholars of religion, us, we, them, have been playing this very sophisticated language game now for decades. The game arrogates to us the right to police what counts as real religion. Regularly saying this is real religion, that's not. Part of this game involves removing the right and the responsibility for teaching about religion from the hands of clerics. Think back to Kishimoto, who regularly was saying the clerics don't know what they're doing. Right? Often scholars have done that by reinforcing and calling on that constitutional prohibition against religious education or sectarian instruction. But in doing so, that's aligned us with state power. Let us teach religion in public schools, not those guys. We'll make kids into good, well-behaved citizens, the argument goes. Explicitly or implicitly, depending on the scholar who's actually making it. I'm pushing pretty hard here, and I'm willing to receive pushback, but I don't think this is really about religious literacy at the end of the day. I think it's about subject formation, and I think it's a nakedly political agenda on the part of scholars of religion that can be traced all the way back to the occupation. I think that we've been doing this for 7 decades, and I think that we need to think of, I suggest humbly that we should think about like what's at stake for us in doing this. I'm going to close out with one more case, which is religious culture education. No, this is another one, Shiukyo Bunka Kyoiku. Okay, so in the wake of the Om Shinrikyo incident, how am I doing that? 5 minutes? In the wake of the Om Shinrikyo incident, there was a lot of hand-wringing on the part of a lot of people, scholars of religion now, and then shortly after that, as we moved into the beginning of the 21st century, there were renewed, moral panics, enjokosai, right? Bullying, ijime, all these sorts of things. You all know that, like the nito, the frita, like it's not Momoiro Yugi anymore, it's enjokosai. Like it's not like that people are going to the pink A guys now that they're going to the Joshi Kosei Kenga. But it's all the same sort of stuff, right? And in reaction to this, we see a number of groups, reacting and saying Japan is in trouble. We need to do something to make the kids good. And so groups start calling for revision to that 1947 law, the fundamental law on education. It's a really interesting amalgamation of forces here, because it's groups like Nippon Kaigi who are making this call. The Shinto Seiji Renmei, that's not surprising that they would get together on this, but also the Japan Buddhist Federation. They're saying Japan's facing these moral crises, and the only way we can solve it is to get kids to be religious. Let us into schools, and we'll solve these problems. I spent a lot of time reading Nippon Kaigi stuff and their rhetoric around this, and I did assume you don't have to. But there's a problem for them. The Constitution supersedes the fundamental law on education. So these people kept saying, like, let's revise the fundamental law on education, let's allow for religious education. But the Constitution is the controlling law. So even if they happen to revise the fundamental law on education to allow for religious education, it still would have been illegal, instant lawsuit, right? But that wasn't the purpose of this kind of rhetoric. The purpose of this rhetoric was to practice for constitutional revision. And I'm saying that that's not speculation on my part, they say it themselves. Nippon Kaigi, you can find them saying like, oh, if we do this, then we can revise the Constitution. Let's see how far we can push. They don't get with it. That's the short version. They do get a revised version of the fundamental law on education in December 2006 under the first Abe administration. But one of the things that does happen is that the clause on religious education changes just slightly. And I apologize, I left this off the slide. It's really crucial. But it basically says the language goes from being you can't engage in religion, the state and its organs can't engage in religious instruction, to knowledge about religion shall be valued, but the state and its organs cannot engage in religious instruction. So it's the knowledge about religion thing that's added. That's the new part. And that's the wedge that allows scholars of religion to get in. I'm going to name names because that's who I am. But so there's a narrative that Om changed everything when it came to Japanese religions. And I think that we've exaggerated that too much. In fact, Giannis, again, I keep citing his book, but it's really good. Giannis suggests that it didn't change things for Japanese society so much as it changed the narratives that we ourselves tell about who we are. And again, when I'm saying we here, I'm talking about scholars of religion, and I'm implicating all of you because you're guilty. So Giannis has basically said, this has changed the ways that we have described who we are, what we do, and why we do it, right? And scholars led by Inoue Nobutaka, but certainly not only him, began advocating a new kind of religious literacy training in Japanese schools. This is going to prevent people from being attracted to groups like Om, was one of the key topics. Now there are some who, like Sakura Yoshihide, I told you I'm naming names, who have like put this forward in terms of like the karuto mondai, and so they've literally used the like sort of anti-cult discourse. I think that Inoue has been a little bit more even-handed in trying to foster religious literacy. And Inoue took to all kinds of venues, national newspapers and so forth, saying the kids these days don't know enough about religion. They need to have better information about religion in order to make informed decisions. And he began calling his approach religious culture education. So again, we've got these modifying terms. You've got religion and education, and then everybody's just throwing in a different modifying term according to the time period, being like, oh, this time we're really going to give them. But it actually, because of that slight change to the fundamental law on education, there's actually an ability for scholars of religion to get in. Now, led by Inoue, a group of scholars starts to put together a proposal for what they call the Shūkyō Bunkashi, the religious culture specialist. This is somebody who will be an expert on religion, who can work in a wide variety of fields, but is supposed to be able to work, among other things, in public schools, providing students with the right information about it. Now, as you can imagine, as soon as you get a bunch of scholars together, like let's just imagine that we got everybody in this row and we asked them, what's the right information about religion? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different definitions about what the right definition of religion would be. Like, and that's exactly what happened. Fujiwara Sato has written about this. I'm just cribbing from her. This is her, not me. They're disagreeing about what that right information is. How do we keep like the religious groups that we don't like from taking over the Shukyo Bunkashi thing. We can't just exclude them, right? But so there's all these there are all these fights. You know, this could easily be turned into an excuse to proselytize in schools. And so what they settle on is, of course, the natural solution, which is to establish a multiple choice test. I want to be, I'm being flippant, but I'm actually very sympathetic. And I have this terrible habit of being like being way too flippant, and then it seems like I'm not sympathetic with the people I'm describing. But I'm actually sympathetic to this. And my curiosity about this indeed came up as I was working at Kokugakuin as a translator, and I was regularly having lunches with Inoue Nobutaka and hearing him talk about this sort of issue and hearing him think in a very thoughtful way about like, well, how do we do this? How do we do it right? You know, what are the ways that we could get this to really work? And so I just want to clarify here that I'm very sympathetic to that. And I think that the thinking that was going into it was rich, deep, and so forth. But I'm also wondering, well, I don't know how to put this in other way than a blunt way, but like, what problem is this? Whose does this solve? Does this actually address a social problem that we collectively have? Or does this address a problem that scholars of religion have? Is it like basically my graduates aren't getting jobs and so therefore I want to get them a job? Or is it like schools really need to have this? So I think it's debatable whether you can like passing a multiple choice test is going to make you an expert on religion. I think that the obvious issues, like I was talking about 13 different sort of answers about what counts as good religious information. You're going to have disputed answers about like or disputed perspectives on what's the right answer on a multiple choice test. But more importantly to me, I've so far found very little evidence that school principals actually want a Shukyo Bunkashi, right? So get the credential, maybe use it to work at like a wedding venue or whatever. But like, do school principals actually want this? Well, if we go based on the way they've responded to things like morality education in the past, they're basically just going to be like, yeah, no, I don't really need that. The kids these days, what they really need is they need literacy. They need to spend more time on the math or whatever. So I think there will be a small number of principals who will want this sort of thing, but I don't think there's widespread influence or widespread evidence that they're interested. So I think that this is a solution to a problem that we created for ourselves. And I think that this goes back to some of Clark's comments yesterday, but I think it's really a reaction to some of the broader issues related to the crisis facing the humanities specifically, but also higher education in general. We've got a demographic crisis in Japan and so forth. How do we stay relevant? So I don't think the issue is religious literacy, but I think it's about continuing the relevance of religious studies. But the question really here is like, well, is that the best way? It's like getting into public schools the best way for us to reach broader publics. Caitlin spoke yesterday very eloquently, as always, about all the different ways that we can reach broad publics. And I just wonder if we might be shooting for the wrong captive audience. And maybe we've been attracted to public school students because they are literally captive. They have to be there, right? Like, I mean, I get it, but is that the right thing for us to do? I apologize. I've been way too far. Let me close up with some takeaway points. I think that the Religious Culture Specialist Initiative, again, I'm sympathetic to it in many respects. But I think it also shows that scholars of religion have often been fairly opportunistic about using perceived crises to claim territory, to land jobs for our graduates, to boost clout for the field. I don't think that's wrong. I think that we've always done that. I just think that we should reflect on it, right? I think we need to pay attention historically. We should historicize that and fit that into a longer pattern. Since at least Kishimoto Hidio's time, and we can go back earlier to the pre-war period as well. We've seen scholars of religion toying with various ways to modify religion in order to get it into schools. We've got religious sentiment, we've got religious knowledge, religious culture, all these different ways that people have talked about things. Shukyo Chishiki, Shukyo Jocho, Shukyo Joso, Shukyo Bunka, right? But all of it is basically like hey, it's not religious education, but it's religious education, right? And I think that these language games, crucially, have gerrymandered expertise. They've excluded clerics while trying to shoehorn religion into the school curriculum. And I think that that's worthy of reflection. And there's no better time to do that than at the 50th anniversary of the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies. So I'm going to stop. And thank you all for listening. And I look forward to your comments and pushback. Thank you.